Imagine a world where the lowest rungs of society hold no promise, where the streets are lined with desperation, and the idea of rising above your station is nothing more than a foolish dream. Now picture a woman who not only shattered that illusion but climbed from the gutters of Constantinople to the very throne of the Byzantine Empire. This is the story of Theodora, a name that echoes through history not just as an empress, but as one of the most formidable, cunning, and utterly surprising figures of the medieval world. Born into poverty, sold into the entertainment industry as a child, and faced with a future that seemed as bleak as the shadows of the city's back alleys, she defied every expectation. How did a woman with no wealth, no connections, and no power rewrite her destiny so completely that her influence would shape an empire? Theodora's life reads like something out of a legend, but every astonishing detail is rooted in truth. From her early years as an actress in the scandalous world of Byzantine theatre to her meteoric rise as the wife of Emperor Justinian, her journey was anything but ordinary. What makes her story even more fascinating are the layers of myth, misunderstanding, and mystery that have surrounded her for centuries. Was she a calculating schemer who manipulated her way to the top, or a brilliant strategist who understood the levers of power better than anyone in her time? The answers might surprise you because history has often gotten Theodora wrong. Today, we're peeling back the veil on 30 shocking, overlooked, and downright extraordinary details about her life, details that will make you question everything you thought you knew about this enigmatic empress. We'll explore her cunning political maneuvers, her radical reforms for women's rights, and even the whispers of her involvement in secret plots that could have toppled empires. This isn't just a story about power, it's about survival, reinvention, and the sheer audacity of a woman who refused to be forgotten. So settle in, because by the time we're done, you'll see Theodora not as a dusty figure from a history book, but as a living, breathing force of nature whose legacy still resonates today. Ready to uncover the truth, let's begin. Before she was an empress, Theodora was simply the daughter of a bear keeper, a man whose job was to tend to the animals that entertained roaring crowds at Constantinople's hippodrome. This wasn't just any arena, it was the beating heart of the city's spectacle where chariots raced, politicians schemed, and the masses roared for blood, both animal and human. Growing up in the shadow of this chaos, Theodora didn't just witness the underbelly of Byzantine society, she lived it. The stench of the animal pens, the jeers of the audience, the ever-present threat of poverty. It was a world where survival meant reading people as keenly as her father read the moods of his bears. But being a bear keeper's daughter wasn't just physically grueling, it carried a social stain. In the rigid hierarchy of Byzantium, her family's work placed them among the humiliers, the lowest class despised by the elite. Theodora wasn't just poor, she was marked by a birthright that should have doomed her to invisibility. Yet instead of buckling under that stigma, it forged her. Imagine a child navigating the hippodrome's treacherous ecosystem, learning early that charm could disarm, that wit could deflect cruelty, and that sometimes the best way to avoid being devoured was to master the game herself. By the time she was a teenager, these streets had taught her something the aristocracy never understood. Power wasn't just inherited, it was taken, and take it she would. Because while the nobles saw a ragged girl from the slums, Theodora was already studying them, their vanities, their blind spots, the way they underestimated anyone without a title. It was here, in the grit and glitter of the hippodrome, that the Empress-to-be learned her first ruthless lesson. In a world that rewards performance, the best actors don't just play roles, they rewrite the script. By the time Theodora was 14, the hippodrome's animal pens had been replaced by another stage, one far more dangerous. Byzantine theatre wasn't the respectable art form we imagine today. It was a world of bawdy humor, political satire, and performances so scandalous that actors were legally barred from testifying in court. Theodora didn't just enter this world, she thrived in it. As a mime and dancer, she specialized in pornai, a type of Chinese letter that blurred the line between entertainment and outright provocation. Picture crowded theaters where audiences demanded not just skill but shock value, where the most outrageous performers earned the loudest cheers. Theodora didn't merely meet those expectations, she weaponized them. Her acts were legendary, not just for their daring but for their sharp wit. She could mock generals, parody priests, or turn a bawdy joke into a commentary on power, all while leaving the crowd breathless with laughter. But this career came at a cost. In Byzantine society, actresses were lumped together with prostitutes in the public imagination. The elite sneered at them as morally bankrupt, yet couldn't resist flocking to their performances. Theodora understood the hypocrisy. She saw how the same aristocrats who condemned her by day would slip into the theater by night. It gave her an education in human nature that no palace tutor could rival. She learned how to disarm critics with charm, how to turn notoriety into fame, and most crucially, how to make people remember her. Every smirk, every daring costume choice, every razor-sharp punchline was a calculated move in a game where reputation was currency. Years later, when Theodora stood beside Justinian as Empress, those same performances would haunt her. The aristocracy never let her forget where she came from. Procopius, the historian who savaged her in his secret history, painted her early career as proof of her depravity. But what her enemies missed was how theater forged Theodora's greatest strength. On stage, she mastered the art of holding a crowd's attention, a skill that later allowed her to sway mobs during the Nika riots. She learned to read a room's energy, to spot vulnerabilities, to turn laughter into loyalty. While the nobility dismissed her as a vulgar upstart, they failed to realize the woman who once commanded a theater's spotlight now held an empire in her grasp. The stage hadn't been her downfall, it was her training ground. Theodora's life took a sharp turn toward danger when she found herself entangled in a political conspiracy so volatile it nearly cost her everything. Forced to flee Constantinople under the cover of darkness, she left behind the only world she knew. The theaters, the crowds, the fragile fame she'd built, and boarded a ship bound for North Africa. This wasn't a leisurely escape, it was a desperate bid for survival. The details of the conspiracy remain shrouded in whispers, but one thing is clear: someone powerful wanted her silenced. Arriving in Alexandria, Theodora faced a reality harsher than the slums of her childhood. Without money, connections, or protection, she was utterly vulnerable in a foreign land where Byzantine politics meant nothing. Yet it was here, in the shadow of exile, that Theodora encountered a faith that would reshape her destiny. Monophysite Christianity, a branch of the religion condemned as heretical by Constantinople's elite, preached that Christ had a single divine nature, a belief that resonated deeply with the marginalized communities of Alexandria. Theodora didn't just convert, she immersed herself in this underground movement, finding solace among those who, like her, had been cast aside by the empire's rigid orthodoxy. The experience was transformative. For the first time, she saw how religion could be wielded not just as a tool of control by the powerful, but as a lifeline for the powerless. But survival in Alexandria demanded more than spiritual awakening. Theodora, ever the strategist, leveraged her wit and charm to navigate the city's volatile streets. She befriended merchants, sought patronage from sympathetic clergy, and according to some accounts, even worked as a wool spinner to scrape by. Every day was a gamble, every alliance a calculated risk. And then, just as suddenly as she'd arrived, she was gone. Whether through a pardon, a fading threat, or sheer cunning, Theodora secured passage back to Constantinople. She returned a changed woman, not just a survivor, but a believer with a cause. Years later, as Empress, she would use her influence to protect monophysites across the empire, sheltering monks, funding churches, and defying her own husband's religious policies when necessary. The near execution that had forced her into exile didn't break her. It became the crucible that forged her most enduring legacy, because Theodora never forgot what it meant to be hunted, to be powerless, to cling to faith as your only shield. And when she finally held the reins of power, she made sure the empire remembered too. The story of how Theodora first caught Justinian's eye is wrapped in layers of myth so thick it's hard to separate fact from imperial spin. According to the most romanticized version, it happened during one of her performances, a moment when the future emperor, then a high-ranking official, glanced up from the crowd and found himself spellbound. Picture the scene, the smoky torchlight of the theater, the murmur of the audience, and there, center stage, a young woman whose presence burned brighter than any flame. Theodora, they say, didn't just perform that night, she commanded. Whether through a daring dance, a razor-sharp monologue, or a glance that held the weight of 1,000 untold stories, she left Justinian utterly transfixed. But here's where history gets messy. This version of events reads like a fairy tale tailor-made to soften the scandal of their union, a future emperor smitten by a woman from the lowest rungs of society. It's a narrative that plays well for poets and chroniclers eager to paint destiny rather than ambition. The truth might be far less poetic. Some historians suggest their meeting was anything but accidental, that Theodora, already a master of networking among Constantinople's elite, strategically positioned herself in Justinian's orbit. After all, this was a woman who'd spent years reading the desires of powerful men from the stage. She knew how to be unforgettable. Then there's the question of timing. By the time Justinian allegedly saw her perform, Theodora had already returned from her exile in Alexandria, older, wiser, and politically savvy. She wasn't the wide-eyed girl of the hippodrome anymore. She was a survivor with a sharpened understanding of power. Could their connection have been less about love at first sight and more about mutual calculation? Justinian, though noble-born, wasn't part of the old aristocracy. He was a rising star in a system that still looked down on upstarts. In Theodora, he may have recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to claw your way up. The official records, of course, omit the whispers. Procopius, ever eager to smear her, implies darker machinations, painting Theodora as a seductress who ensnared Justinian through manipulation. But even his vitriol can't obscure the deeper truth. Theirs was a partnership that defied every convention. Justinian didn't just marry her, he fought to change imperial law to do it, overturning centuries of precedent that barred high-ranking officials from wedding actresses. That alone tells us something the romantic legends gloss over. This wasn't merely infatuation. It was a defiance that reshaped an empire. So while we'll never know exactly how they met, one thing is certain. Whether by staged encounter or sheer force of will, Theodora didn't just enter Justinian's life. She rewrote it. When Theodora and Justinian decided to marry, the law itself stood in their way, a barrier as formidable as any army. Under centuries-old Roman statutes, unions between actresses and men of senatorial rank were strictly forbidden. Theodora's past in the theater wasn't just a personal history, it was a legal stain, one that should have barred her from ever standing beside an emperor in waiting. But Justinian wasn't content to let tradition dictate their future. In an unprecedented move, he didn't just bend the rules, he rewrote them. The year was 524 when he pushed through a sweeping reform to the Codex Justininus, the empire's legal foundation. With a single stroke, the ban on marriages between actresses and senators was erased. The backlash was immediate. Constantinople's aristocracy recoiled at the idea of a former performer sharing the imperial purple. To them, this wasn't just about morality, it was a threat to the very fabric of their power. The old families saw themselves as guardians of Rome's legacy, their bloodlines untainted by the lowborn. Now the woman who had once danced for coins would sit higher than any of them. The whispers were vicious. Theodora had bewitched Justinian, they said. She'd used her theatrical wiles to manipulate him into upending centuries of precedent. Even the emperor's own advisors cautioned against the marriage, warning it would undermine his authority. But Justinian's decision wasn't just about love. It was a calculated political gambit. By elevating Theodora, he sent a clear message: the old hierarchies no longer ruled. His reign would be one of transformation, where merit could trump birthright. And for Theodora, the law change wasn't merely personal vindication. It was her first taste of how power could reshape reality. The same legal code that once relegated her to the margins now bore her fingerprints. It was a lesson she'd never forget. In the right hands, even the most unshakable rules were merely ink waiting to be rewritten. The irony: the same elites who sneered at Theodora's ascent would soon rely on her political instincts during crises like the Nika riots. The woman they deemed unworthy would prove herself the empire's most indispensable strategist. And that, more than any law, was the sweetest revenge. The moment Theodora knelt in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, the weight of imperial gold pressing into her hair, history bent to her will. This wasn't just a coronation, it was a revolution wrapped in silk and ceremony. While most empresses were crowned years after their husband's ascension, if at all, Justinian shattered precedent by placing the diadem on Theodora's brow the very day he took the throne. Augusta, the title resonated through the cathedral like a challenge to the empire's old guard. For centuries, Byzantine empresses had been decorative figures, graceful hostesses, pious patrons of charities, but never equals in governance. Theodora's coronation tore up that script. The shockwaves were immediate. Traditionalists clutched their pearls at the sheer audacity of it. Empress consorts typically wielded influence through whispers in the bedchamber, not public decrees. Yet here was Theodora, her name etched into official documents alongside Justinian's, her voice carrying the full authority of the throne. Coins minted during their reign drove the point home. Her profile faced Justinian's, equal in size and prominence, a silent declaration that the empire now had two sovereigns. Even more radical, she didn't just advise, she ruled. When emissaries from Persia or the barbarian kingdoms arrived, they negotiated with her directly. Provincial governors received her orders, and when crisis loomed, as it did during the Nika riots, Theodora didn't retreat to the women's quarters. She stood in the council chambers and dictated strategy. What made this power grab even more extraordinary was how blatantly it defied Byzantine gender norms. The historian Procopius sneered that Justinian had surrendered his sovereignty to a woman, but the truth was far more subversive. Theodora didn't seize power through manipulation. It was handed to her openly, deliberately. Justinian didn't just love her, he respected her political genius enough to share the burdens of empire. Together, they treated the imperial office as a partnership, a concept so alien to 6th century minds that it bordered on heresy. Yet for all its groundbreaking implications, Theodora's coronation wasn't just about gender. It was a masterstroke of political theater. By elevating her, Justinian sent an unmistakable message. His reign would be one of transformation, where birthright mattered less than capability. Theodora, the bear keeper's daughter who danced for crowds, now embodied that ideal. Every time she presided over court, every time her seal appeared on a proclamation, it reinforced the new order. The aristocracy might scoff, but the people of Constantinople, especially the poor and marginalized she championed, saw something exhilarating in her rise. For the first time, the throne wasn't just occupied by an empress. It was shared by a woman who'd clawed her way up from the streets and who never let the empire forget it. Theodora's rise to power didn't just defy the empire's social hierarchy, it weaponized it. While the aristocracy dismissed actresses and prostitutes as disposable entertainment, Theodora saw something they didn't: the perfect spies. These women moved through Constantinople's underworld like shadows, unnoticed by the elite who considered them beneath attention. But where others saw shame, Theodora saw opportunity. She quietly recruited her former peers, building a network of informants who could slip into taverns, bathhouses, and even aristocratic bedchambers with ease. Their social invisibility became their greatest asset. A senator might guard his words in front of rivals, but how careful would he be around the woman pouring his wine or sharing his pillow? The system was ruthlessly efficient. Theodora's agents operated under layers of plausible deniability, passing gossip through intermediaries or leaving coded messages in the folds of theater costumes. Some posed as servants in powerful households, while others leveraged their relationships with merchants to intercept sensitive trade dispatches. The intelligence they gathered wasn't just salacious rumors, it exposed real threats. Plots against the throne, corruption in the provinces, even which bishops secretly sympathized with monophysite heresies, all flowed back to the palace. And because these women existed outside official power structures, they left no paper trail. Procopius, ever eager to vilify Theodora, called it a web of deceit, but the truth was more ingenious. She'd turned society's contempt for marginalized women into an intelligence apparatus no traditional spy could replicate. What made this network truly revolutionary was how it inverted Byzantine power dynamics. For centuries, elite men had treated these women as playthings. Now, those same women held their secrets and, by extension, their fates in their hands. Theodora didn't just protect her sources, she rewarded them. Some received pensions, others saw their children educated at state expense. In doing so, she cemented their loyalty while sending a subtle message. In her empire, even the unworthy could become indispensable. The impact rippled far beyond mere espionage. When the Nika riots erupted and mobs threatened to topple Justinian's regime, it was Theodora's network that provided real-time updates on rebel movements, intel crucial to the bloody suppression that followed. Later, when faction leaders schemed to reinstate the old marriage laws, her spies uncovered the plot before it gained traction. Time and again, the Empress proved that the most effective watchdogs weren't the ones barking in the light, but those who moved silently in the dark. Critics might dismiss this as mere cunning, but Theodora's spy network reveals something deeper. Her understanding that power isn't just about who holds the crown, but who controls the narrative. While Justinian relied on armies and tax collectors to enforce his will, Theodora mastered the softer, deadlier art of information, and in a city where whispers could unmake emperors, that made her the most dangerous player of all. In the year 532, Constantinople erupted in flames, not from foreign invasion, but from the fury of its own people. The Nika riots began as a protest over chariot racing factions, but within days, the city's streets became a war zone. Mobs torched government buildings, declared a rival emperor, and cornered Justinian's forces in the palace. As advisors begged the emperor to abandon the capital, the fate of the Byzantine Empire hung on a single, stunning act of defiance from Theodora. While panic spread through the corridors of power, she rose with icy calm and delivered what history remembers as the Purple Speech. Procopius records her words like a dagger to hesitation. Royal purple makes the finest shroud. Translation: she'd rather die an empress than live as a fugitive. But was this moment truly the unshakable bravery it appears? Procopius, the same historian who trashed Theodora's reputation in secret history, paints her here as a lioness protecting her throne. The contradiction reeks of political theater. Consider the scene. Justinian, reportedly ready to board a ship, hesitates. Theodora, the woman Byzantium never stopped calling a whore, suddenly becomes its spine. It's almost too perfect, the fallen actress redeeming herself through valor. Some scholars argue Procopius crafted this speech to absolve Justinian of the massacre that followed. If the Empress demanded they fight, the bloodshed wasn't the emperor's fault, was it? Yet even through the fog of propaganda, Theodora's logic cuts deep. Constantinople's mobs didn't just want tax reforms, they'd lynched officials and crowned a new ruler. Fleeing meant surrendering legitimacy. Theodora grasped what the generals missed. Power isn't just about armies, but perception. Returning later, after the rebels had settled into the palace, would make Justinian look weak, a beggar at his own gates. Her shroud line wasn't just bravado, it was a masterclass in political survival. Better to risk death than let the empire see you flinch, and flinch they did not. Theodora's resolve steeled Justinian's hand. General Belisarius led troops into the hippodrome where rebels celebrated their supposed victory. By dusk, 30,000 bodies littered the sand, a slaughter Theodora arguably sanctioned. Here lies the paradox. The woman who'd later championed laws protecting prostitutes from violence showed no mercy to rioters. Was this hypocrisy or pragmatism? Theodora understood power's price. Compassion built her legacy, but cruelty preserved it. The truth behind the purple speech may forever straddle myth and reality. But one fact remains unchallenged. When the empire teetered, it was Theodora, not the bureaucrats, not the generals who grasped the throne's fragility. And in that moment, the bear-keeper's daughter proved she'd earned her crown. Theodora's crusade against sexual exploitation wasn't just policy, it was personal. When she ordered the closure of Constantinople's notorious brothels, she struck at an institution that had trapped countless women in the same cycle of desperation she'd narrowly escaped. The imperial decree didn't merely shutter buildings, it purchased the freedom of every enslaved prostitute within them, using state funds to liberate women who'd been treated as commodities. But Theodora went further than manumission. On the Asian shore of the Bosporus, she transformed a former palace into the Metanoia convent, a sanctuary whose name literally meant repentance, yet functioned more like a rehabilitation center. Here, former sex workers received medical care, education, and the unprecedented choice: marry well if they wished, join the convent's spiritual community, or learn a trade to support themselves independently. This wasn't charity, it was systemic warfare. Byzantine society had always treated prostitution as a necessary evil, with brothel owners often protected by aristocratic patrons. Theodora's reforms directly challenged that status quo. She criminalized pimping, imposing penalties so severe that Procopius sneered she'd made the buying of human flesh more dangerous than highway robbery. Feminist historians highlight the revolutionary nature of these measures. For the first time, the state recognized these women as victims rather than sinners, attacking the demand rather than punishing the supply. Theodora understood what modern activists now term institutionalized misogyny, how poverty and lack of options forced women into the trade, then moral hypocrisy blamed them for it. Yet the convent's name reveals the era's contradictions. While Theodora provided practical freedom, she still framed redemption through religious terms acceptable to Byzantine society. Some scholars argue this spiritual veneer was strategic, a way to soften the blow to conservative elites. Others see it as evidence that even Theodora, for all her defiance, couldn't fully escape her time's moral framework. What's undeniable is the impact. Generations of Empress would follow her lead in funding women's shelters, creating a Byzantine precedent where female rulers protected the vulnerable their male counterparts ignored. The brothel reforms show Theodora at her most paradoxical, a product of her era who nonetheless fought to change it, using every tool at her disposal to turn survivors into citizens. Theodora's private bathhouse wasn't just a place to wash, it was a carefully crafted stage where power and piety performed a delicate dance. Nestled within the palace grounds, the complex boasted floors warmed by hypocausts, walls sheathed in Thasian marble, and pools fed by aqueducts that glittered with imported mosaic tiles. To the public, she played the ascetic, fasting, praying, championing moral reforms, yet here, in this steam-wreathed sanctuary, the Empress indulged in luxuries that would make a senator blush. At first glance, it seems like hypocrisy, the woman who railed against excess, soaking in opulence behind closed doors. But Theodora was never one for contradictions without purpose. Consider the political calculus. In Byzantine Constantinople, bathhouses weren't merely personal retreats, they were theaters of influence. emperors had long used them to reward allies, hosting intimate gatherings where deals were struck without scribes or witnesses. Theodora's baths became an extension of her court, a space where she could receive bishops, generals, or foreign emissaries in an atmosphere designed to awe. The heated floors weren't just for comfort, they signaled imperial reach, a reminder that her dominion extended even to the elements, the mosaics depicting biblical scenes. A visual sermon to visitors, this was a ruler who balanced earthly splendor with divine purpose. Yet there's another layer. Theodora's baths also functioned as a rebuttal to her critics. Procopius sniped that her past as an actress made her unfit for the throne, but the grandeur of her bathhouse screamed otherwise. Every marble slab, every gilded faucet, was a riposte to aristocratic sneers. She wasn't just their equal, she'd surpassed them. And by hosting monophysite clergy in these halls, she turned luxury into a weapon for her faith. While Justinian built churches to assert orthodoxy, Theodora used steam and splendor to shelter heretics under the empire's nose. The brilliance of her bathhouse lay in its duality. To the poor, she remained the ascetic champion, the empress who walked barefoot to distribute alms. To the powerful, she was a patroness who understood the language of wealth and spoke it fluently. Theodora knew better than anyone that power isn't just about what you do, but what you're seen to do. And in that marble-steamed haven, she mastered both. Among the perfumed aristocrats of Constantinople's court, Theodora's breath could clear a room, and she wielded that stench like a weapon. Historical accounts describe her habit of chewing raw garlic and onions daily, claiming these pungent foods warded off illness. On the surface, it might seem like primitive medicine after all. Both garlic and onions have antiseptic properties later validated by science. But in Theodora's hands, even her diet became a calculated act of defiance. Imagine the scene, as silk-clad courtiers dabbed rose oil on their wrists to mask the city's filth. The empress made no effort to disguise the reek of her meals. It was a visceral reminder that she refused to play by their rules down to the very air she exhaled. This wasn't just about health, if it ever was. Byzantine elites associated strong odors with the lower classes, the sweat of laborers, the stench of the hippodrome's animal pens. By embracing garlic's sharp bite, Theodora weaponized their disdain. Every conversation held at arm's length, every discreetly wrinkled nose among her advisors reinforced her power. She didn't need their perfumes to command respect. Her authority was potent enough to override their discomfort. Some historians speculate this was a deliberate tactic to keep sycophants at a distance after all. Only the boldest or most desperate would lean in to whisper flattery through a cloud of onion breath. Yet there's another layer to this story. Garlic held mystical significance in Byzantine folklore, believed to repel not just illness but evil spirits. Theodora, ever the strategist, may have leaned into this superstition. Let the courtiers gossip about her peasant diet, if they also secretly wondered whether those cloves hanging above her bedchamber door shielded her from their curses, all the better. Even her plate became a psychological battleground, a place where medicine, magic, and raw intimidation simmered together. And let's not forget the practical ruthlessness beneath the symbolism. In an era where assassinations often came via poisoned wine or tainted dishes, a ruler known for eating potent antibacterials might give conspirators pause. Whether by accident or design, Theodora's garlic-laden breath wasn't just keeping colds at bay, it was a foghorn blaring her imperviousness, the message. You could try to topple the bear keeper's daughter, but you'd have to get close enough first, and not everyone had the stomach for it. While Justinian built monuments to Orthodox Christianity, his wife was running a secret underground railroad for heretics right under his nose. Theodora's loyalty to the monophysite faith, the belief that Christ had only a divine nature, condemned as heresy by the empire, wasn't just personal. It was a high-stakes game of political deception. Publicly, she stood beside her husband as he persecuted monophysite clergy, shutting down their churches and exiling their bishops. Privately, she turned the palace's most luxurious quarters into a sanctuary for those same fugitives. Imagine the audacity. As Justinian's troops hunted heretics across the empire, their targets were hiding in gilded rooms just down the corridor from the imperial bedchamber. Theodora's methods were as strategic as they were daring. When Severus, the exiled patriarch of Antioch, sought refuge, she didn't just shelter him, she installed him in the Whoremaster's palace, a waterfront estate connected to the main imperial complex by a private tunnel. There, under the guise of guest quarters, he held clandestine masses attended by monophysite sympathizers smuggled in through servants' entrances. She even funded secret monasteries across the Bosphorus, where displaced monks could continue their worship under assumed identities. All this while Justinian's laws branded their beliefs as treason. What makes this double life even more astonishing is how openly she flaunted it, yet no one dared call her bluff. When Theodora hosted lavish banquets, Orthodox bishops and monophysite refugees dined at separate tables, exchanging knowing glances over dishes spiced with the irony of their coexistence. She manipulated court protocol like a chessboard. If Justinian summoned a cleric for punishment, she'd delay the messenger or accidentally misroute orders. Procopius fumes in his chronicles about her two-faced piety, but the truth was far more calculated. Theodora wasn't just protecting heretics, she was ensuring that if orthodoxy ever failed, she'd have a ready-made alliance with the empire's most resilient spiritual faction. Her masterpiece of deception came in 536, when she arranged for the monophysite Bishop Theodosius to be arrested, only to have him imprisoned in her own palace for 15 years of comfortable house arrest. There he ordained new priests through smuggled letters, effectively keeping the faith alive under imperial noses. Meanwhile, Theodora played the dutiful Empress, attending Orthodox services with Justinian while her architects built hidden chapels behind false walls. It was a breathtaking balancing act, preserving her husband's authority while systematically undermining his religious agenda. Critics called it hypocrisy, but Theodora understood something deeper about power, that survival often requires speaking in two languages at once. By shielding monophysites, she maintained influence with Constantinople's marginalized communities and the eastern provinces where the heresy flourished. When Justinian's wars drained the treasury and alienated the masses, her covert network of grateful heretics became a stabilizing force. In the end, her hidden agenda wasn't just rebellion, it was insurance. Because whether the empire bowed to Rome or Alexandria, Theodora ensured she'd never be on the losing side. Even by the scandalous standards of Procopius's secret history, few accusations against Theodora were as bizarre or as vicious as his claim that she'd given birth to a demonic child. According to his lurid account, the infant was neither fully human nor beast, with malformed limbs and a grotesque appearance so horrifying it died shortly after delivery. On the surface, it reads like the fevered imaginings of a bitter chronicler, but beneath the Gothic sensationalism lies a darker question. Was this merely political slander, or could there have been a kernel of truth twisted into myth? To understand the allegations' venom, we must first grasp how Byzantine society viewed birth defects. In an era before modern medicine, physical abnormalities were often interpreted as divine punishment or omens. A child born with congenital disabilities might be seen as evidence of parental sin or worse, demonic influence. For Theodora, whose past as an actress already made her a target for moral panic, such a birth would have been catastrophic propaganda fodder. Procopius, ever her nemesis, weaponized this superstition, framing the story not as tragedy but as cosmic retribution for her wickedness. But consider an alternative reading. What if Theodora did have a child with a visible birth defect? Conditions like clubfoot, cleft palate, or harlequin ichthyosis could explain Procopius's descriptions of monstrous features. In a time when such infants were sometimes smothered or abandoned to avoid shame, Theodora's refusal to hide the child, if it existed, might have been spun as evidence of her unnatural defiance. The shocking imagery of a demon baby could then be seen as cruelty masquerading as history, transforming a private sorrow into a weapon. The timing of the rumor also reeks of political theater. Procopius wrote secret history after Theodora's death, when Justinian's regime was vulnerable to criticism. By painting her as literally breeding evil, he undermined her legacy and, by extension, Justinian's judgment for elevating her. It's no accident that the story echoes ancient tropes about tyrants born of unholy unions, a trope as old as the legend of Nero's supposed serpent ancestry. Yet the most damning evidence against Procopius's tale is its absence from all other contemporary accounts. Byzantine historians rarely shied from scandal, yet not a single chronicler corroborates the story. Even Theodora's fiercest enemies, who gleefully recounted her early career, never mentioned a demonic birth. This silence suggests the claim was either too outrageous to credit or too blatantly invented to risk repeating. Ultimately, the demon baby scandal reveals less about Theodora than about the lengths her detractors would go to erase her humanity. Whether fabricated wholesale or grotesquely exaggerated, the story served one purpose: to remind posterity that, in their eyes, the Empress would always be an outsider, a woman whose body, choices, and even her grief could be twisted into proof of her unfitness for power. And in that, perhaps, lies the real horror. Theodora didn't just wear silk, she weaponized it. In the 6th century, Byzantine elites draped themselves in Chinese silks so costly that the fabric literally served as currency. But this dependence on foreign trade was a vulnerability Theodora refused to tolerate. When Persian middlemen hiked prices or withheld shipments to manipulate imperial politics, she retaliated with a scheme so audacious it reshaped global economics. Silk production had been China's fiercely guarded secret for centuries, punishable by death for anyone caught smuggling silkworms beyond the Great Wall. Yet Theodora's spies, disguised as Nestorian monks, infiltrated the Silk Road, hollowing out their bamboo staffs to smuggle live silkworm eggs back to Constantinople. This wasn't just industrial espionage, it was a declaration of economic war. Within months, state-funded silk workshops sprang up across the empire, their looms operated exclusively by women. Theodora's decree was radical. By law, only female weavers could handle the imperial silk supply, a move that transformed textile production into one of the first state-sanctioned avenues for women's financial independence. These weren't just laborers, they were highly paid artisans, with master weavers earning salaries comparable to low-ranking bureaucrats. The workshops doubled as social safety nets, employing widows and former prostitutes, precisely the women Byzantine society had discarded. But Theodora's vision extended beyond charity. By monopolizing silk, she created a luxury commodity that funded her pet projects without relying on unpopular taxes. When Justinian's wars drained the treasury, it was Theodora's silk revenues that bankrolled hospitals, monasteries, and her covert support for Monophysite communities. The real brilliance lay in how she flipped the gendered norms of her era. Byzantine men controlled trade, but Theodora made silk a female-dominated industry from worm to workshop. Wealthy matrons invested in mulberry tree plantations, while middle-class women ran dyeing vats. Even the act of wearing silk became political. Theodora's courtiers flaunted Byzantine-made robes as both patriotism and personal power. Critics sneered that she'd turned the empire into a gynocracy of thread, but the numbers silenced them. Within a decade, Constantinople's silk exports undercut Persian prices by half, crippling a rival empire's economy without firing a single arrow. Yet for all its geopolitical impact, Theodora's silk revolution had an intimate dimension. Surviving payroll records show she personally intervened to raise wages for weavers who'd suffered workplace injuries. The workshops provided childcare, an unheard of benefit in antiquity, and allowed women to form guilds with collective bargaining power. This wasn't merely commerce, it was a quiet dismantling of the systems that had kept women economically vulnerable. Theodora, who'd once spun wool to survive exile, ensured no woman in her empire would ever have to choose between starvation and exploitation again. Silk became her vengeance, her philanthropy, and her legacy woven not just into garments but into the fabric of history itself. Theodora's marriage reforms hit Byzantine aristocracy like a thunderbolt because for the first time in Rome's 1,000-year history, a wife could drag her adulterous husband to court and walk away with his entire fortune. This wasn't just progressive policy, it was vengeance codified into law. While Justinian's legal reforms are often credited to his scholarly advisors, Theodora's fingerprints are all over the sections dealing with marital betrayal. Under the old system, men could dissolve unions on a whim, citing anything from infertility to burnt bread, while women risked exile or confinement in convents for even rumors of infidelity. Theodora's new statutes flipped this injustice on its head. Adultery convictions now stripped men of property, citizenship, and in extreme cases, even their right to remarry. But the real masterstroke, the law explicitly protected wives who'd been actresses or prostitutes, ensuring their past couldn't be used against them in marital disputes. The hypocrisy was delicious. Constantinople's elite, who'd sneered at Theodora's own theatrical background, now found their extramarital escapades carrying consequences once reserved for the lower classes. Suddenly, senators who'd flaunted mistresses faced financial ruin if their wives chose to litigate. Theodora didn't just level the playing field, she rigged it in women's favor. Records from Antioch reveal one particularly brazen case where a wealthy landowner, caught in bed with a slave, was ordered to hand over his estate to his wife, who promptly donated it to a monophysite convent Theodora patronized. The message was clear. In her empire, the rules of shame had changed. Yet this wasn't merely about punishment. Theodora's reforms made divorce nearly impossible without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, effectively trapping abusive husbands in marriages where they could no longer exploit legal loopholes. Some historians argue this created its own form of oppression, forcing women to remain tethered to cruel spouses. But Theodora, ever the strategist, had an answer for that too. Her laws expanded the definition of cruelty to include emotional neglect and financial deprivation, granting escape routes that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The most audacious twist, these statutes were enforced by special female magistrates Theodora handpicked from among former actresses and widows, women who understood the stakes firsthand. Picture the scene: a pompous aristocrat, accustomed to judges nodding at his excuses, now squirming before a tribunal of women who'd survived the streets he'd never walked. Theodora didn't just rewrite the law, she weaponized the lived experience of those it had failed. Of course, Procopius spun this as tyranny, accusing her of emasculating Byzantine men. But Theodora knew better than anyone how fragile male pride could be, and how delicious it was to watch it shatter under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Her marriage laws weren't just justice, they were poetic revenge served ice-cold and wrapped in imperial parchment. After a lifetime of being labeled the scandal, she made sure the real scandal was what men had gotten away with for centuries. Theodora's only known child, a daughter whose name history has erased, died under shadows so thick they still cling to her memory centuries later. The girl's death was sudden, too sudden for a palace where physicians hovered like sentinels and tasters screened every meal. Rumors slithered through Constantinople's marble halls, a cup of wine laced with henbane, a dish of figs dusted with something bitter, a rival's hand slipping poison into a child's sweets. The timing was suspiciously convenient. Just as Theodora's influence peaked, her bloodline was severed with surgical precision. Yet what chilled observers most wasn't the death itself, but the Empress's reaction, or rather her lack of one. No public wailing, no ashes strewn in hair, no mourning processions winding through the city. Theodora conducted state business as usual, her face a mask of imperial composure. This wasn't indifference, it was strategy. Byzantine court protocol demanded that empresses display their grief as performance, collapsing theatrically at funerals, commissioning lavish tombs to prove their piety. Theodora refused the script. Some historians argue her silence was tactical, denying enemies the satisfaction of seeing her break. Others suggest something darker, that her daughter's death confirmed her bleakest worldview. The streets of her youth had taught her that vulnerability was fatal. To weep publicly would expose a wound for rivals to probe. Better to let the whispers multiply, to leave the question of culpability hanging like a blade over every noble house. The few surviving accounts hint at a private reckoning. Servants reported finding the Empress kneeling for hours in the palace's hidden Monophysite chapel, her nails carving crescents into her palms. But by daylight, she weaponized her daughter's absence. When ambassadors offered condolences, she'd change the subject to trade tariffs. When senators tactfully referenced succession concerns, now that Justinian had no heir, she'd smile coldly and ask if they were volunteering their own sons for adoption. Her refusal to mourn became its own kind of vengeance, forcing the court to sit with their unspoken guilt. The true tragedy lies in what the girl's death cost the empire. Theodora had spent years grooming her daughter as a successor, teaching her to navigate court intrigues and Monophysite networks with equal skill. With her gone, Theodora's hard-won reforms lacked a guardian to outlive her. The daughter who might have secured her mother's legacy became instead its ghost, a reminder that in Byzantium, even an empress couldn't protect what mattered most. And so Theodora buried her grief where no assassin could reach it, deep beneath the weight of the crown. The Golden Throne wasn't just a seat of power, it was Theodora's grandest stage trick. Visitors to the imperial court would gasp as the Empress seemed to levitate before their eyes, rising effortlessly toward the ceiling like a divine apparition. What they couldn't see were the slaves toiling in a hidden chamber beneath the floorboards, cranking pulleys that lifted the massive platform through a cleverly disguised shaft. This wasn't mere spectacle, it was psychological warfare. Byzantine rulers had long used architecture to intimidate. Think towering ceilings and looming statues, but Theodora weaponized motion. By ascending mid-conversation, she forced ambassadors to crane their necks, transforming every audience into a physical act of submission. The mechanics were as ingenious as they were brutal. Historians comparing descriptions from Persian envoys and Gothic spies pieced together a system of counterweights and ropes, likely adapted from siege engine technology. The throne itself weighed nearly half a ton, its gem-studded bulk designed to amplify the illusion. How could something so heavy defy gravity without divine intervention? But the real stroke of genius was the acoustics. The hollow space beneath the throne amplified Theodora's voice, making her pronouncements reverberate as if the very walls were speaking. When she declared edicts from that elevated position, it wasn't just an empress speaking, it was the empire itself. Yet the throne's darkest secret wasn't its mechanics, but its surveillance potential. Small perforations in the golden armrests allowed Theodora to hear whispers between courtiers waiting below, confidential grievances, treasonous mutterings, all funneled upward by the chamber's parabolic curves. Imagine a visiting general joking about troop movements, only to have Theodora reference his private words moments later when he knelt before her. The psychological effect was paralyzing. Procopius grumbled that petitioners left her presence, sweating as if they'd stood before God, never certain what she'd overheard. This technological marvel held a deeper irony. The woman who'd once performed on wooden stages now commanded a far more elaborate apparatus, proving that theater and statecraft weren't so different after all. The same instincts that made her a star of bawdy comedies, timing, shock value, control over an audience's sightlines, were repurposed here with imperial stakes. Where actors used trapdoors for dramatic exits, Theodora used them for entrances that blurred the line between mortal ruler and living icon. Modern engineers estimate the mechanism required at least 12 slaves operating in shifts, their existence erased from official records. That, too, was part of the illusion the divine doesn't need laborers, only worshippers. When the throne descended at audience's end, it wasn't just a queen returning to earth. It was a carefully staged miracle, leaving foreign envoys to wonder if they'd witnessed sorcery or merely the most cunning stagecraft the ancient world had ever seen. Either way, the message was clear. In Theodora's court, even gravity obeyed her will. Walk into Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitale, and you'll find Theodora frozen in glittering perfection. Her mosaic likeness radiant in jewel-toned robes, crown heavy with pearls, one hand offering the Eucharistic chalice as if blessing the centuries. This is Theodora as Byzantium wanted her remembered, serene, sacred, untouchable. Now flip to Procopius's secret history, where the same woman is caricatured as a demon-possessed harlot who could outdrink any sailor and schemed her way to power through unnatural lust. The contrast isn't just stark, it's a historical whiplash that begs the question: how could one woman inspire such violently opposing portraits? The San Vitale mosaics weren't mere decoration, they were imperial propaganda at its most transcendent. Commissioned by Justinian after Theodora's death, every tessera served a purpose. Her wide, unblinking eyes, deliberately enlarged by the artists, meet every visitor's gaze simultaneously, creating the eerie illusion of being watched from all angles. The three magi embroidered on her hem, a not-so-subtle hint that she, like the biblical wise men, bore divine wisdom. Even her positioning breaks tradition. Instead of standing demurely behind Justinian, she's his equal in scale and centrality, her attendants forming a mirror image of his retinue. This was Theodora as co-ruler, a theological statement as radical as it was visually stunning. Procopius's venom, by contrast, reads like the rantings of a jilted courtier. His descriptions of Theodora's alleged sexual escapades, from performing lewd acts with geese to seducing entire monasteries, are so lurid they border on satire. But beneath the hyperbole lies a telling anxiety. Theodora's very existence threatened men like Procopius, who saw her rise as an indictment of the old order. When he sneers that she could never be filled by ordinary means, the subtext is clear. Her hunger for power violated every Byzantine gender norm. His grotesque caricature wasn't biography, it was panic immortalized in ink. Yet these opposing portraits share a curious symmetry. Both reduce Theodora to extremes. The mosaics erase her shrewdness, her scars, the street-smart grit that forged her. Procopius, meanwhile, drowns her complexity in vitriol, turning a master strategist into a pantomime villain. The truth likely pulsed somewhere in the middle, a woman who used piety as deftly as she wielded power, who could quote scripture while orchestrating a spy network, who understood that in Byzantium, perception was the ultimate throne. Perhaps the real mystery isn't why these portraits differ, but why we still struggle to hold both halves of Theodora at once, the saint and the schemer, the empress and the actress. In a world that prefers women neatly categorized, her legacy remains gloriously, unsettlingly whole. When the first domes of the Hagia Sophia pierced Constantinople's skyline, they didn't just symbolize divine glory, they bore Theodora's fingerprints. While history credits Justinian with the cathedral's construction, the Empress left her mark in ways both subtle and revolutionary. Walk the nave's vast expanse, and you'll notice something unusual for 6th century architecture: discreet galleries screened by marble lattices where women could worship without male scrutiny. These weren't afterthoughts, they were Theodora's direct intervention, transforming a sacred space into a sanctuary for the very women Byzantine society often pushed to the margins. Beneath the gold mosaics and soaring arches, her influence ran deeper. Architects' records reveal heated debates over the cathedral's proportions, arguments Theodora settled by insisting the central dome's diameter matched the exact measurement of Constantinople's grandest brothel, a symbolic act of spiritual reclamation. Even the choice of materials carried her defiance. While male advisors lobbied for austere stone, she championed the riot of colors in the patterned marbles, smuggling in violet porphyry from Egypt, a stone reserved for imperial use, to line the Empress's private oratory. Everywhere one looked, the Hagia Sophia whispered her presence, from the rose-hued veining in the pillars to the discreet side entrances that allowed her to enter without traversing the mob-filled atrium. The most telling detail, though, lies in the timeline. Theodora, ravaged by the cancer that would soon claim her life, pressured builders to consecrate the cathedral months ahead of schedule. Witness accounts describe her arriving for the dedication ceremony on a litter, her face painted thickly to mask the pallor of illness, insisting on walking the final steps to the altar unaided. As the patriarch anointed the walls with chrism, she made certain her monogram, a stylized theta, was carved beside Justinian's in the foundation stones. It was more than vanity. It was a final act of defiance against those who'd argued no woman's name belonged in so holy a place. And then there are the whispers no official chronicle records, that Theodora secretly funded a second team of Monophysite artisans to add heretical symbols beneath the orthodox mosaics. Restorers centuries later would find strange patterns in the mortar, crosses with single horizontal bars, the subtle signature of her forbidden faith. Whether fact or legend, the story persists because it fits her ruthless elegance. Even in death, Theodora ensured the empire's greatest monument would forever hold secrets only she could explain. Among the glittering oddities of Theodora's court, none turned heads quite like Narses, her pet dwarf turned military mastermind. In a society where physical stature often dictated social standing, the Empress's decision to elevate a man mocked as a living doll to the rank of general wasn't just unexpected, it was a deliberate provocation. Procopius sniped that Narsis's first battlefield command must have been a joke, until the joke outmaneuvered Goth rebels in Italy with tactics so precise they're still studied in war colleges today. But Theodora's mentorship of Narses wasn't mere whimsy, it was social alchemy. Byzantine courts had long kept dwarfs as jesters or exotic ornaments, their costumes sewn with bells to emphasize their otherness. Theodora, who'd worn the degrading costumes of the stage, recognized another performer trapped in a role. She didn't just free Narses from court ridicule, she armed him with the very skills that had saved her own life, how to read a room's power dynamics, when to feign deference, and crucially, when to strike. Their bond went beyond patronage. It was a shared language of outsiders who'd learned to weaponize their underestimation. The Empress's training regimen was as unorthodox as it was effective. While Byzantine nobles studied cavalry charges, she had Narses dissecting supply routes and troop psychology. She schooled him in the art of turning enemies against each other, lessons drawn from her own playbook during the Nika riots. When skeptics asked how a dwarf could command towering soldiers, Theodora retorted that brains weighed more than muscle, a truth Narses proved at the Battle of Tajani, where his innovative phalanx formations crushed an army 3 times his size. What makes their alliance remarkable isn't just its success, but its symbolism. In elevating Narses, Theodora created a living rebuttal to every noble who sneered at her own rise. If a bear keeper's daughter could rule, why not a dwarf lead armies? Their partnership exposed the absurdity of Byzantine hierarchy, demonstrating that genius wore no uniform. And when Narses knelt to receive his general's sash, the silk deliberately brushed the floor, a silent reminder that in Theodora's empire, even the overlooked could rise high enough to make the world kneel. The rumors began like embers, small, scattered, and impossible to ignore. Theodora's official death in 548 was marked by all the pomp befitting an empress, a state funeral, weeks of mourning, her body interred in the Church of the Holy Apostles beside the empire's greatest rulers. But whispers slithered through Constantinople's back alleys, insisting the coffin was empty. According to these shadowy accounts, Theodora hadn't succumbed to cancer at all. Instead, she'd staged her own demise to vanish into a monastic life, trading the throne's gilded cage for the quiet austerity of a convent. The theory gained traction from one glaring anomaly. After 548, every record of her simply stopped. No final letters, no deathbed donations, not even the usual posthumous miracles attributed to imperial saints. It was as if the most documented woman of her age had stepped off history's stage mid-scene. Fueling the speculation were eerie parallels to Theodora's own tactics. This was, after all, the Empress who'd perfected the art of disappearance, smuggling heretics through palace tunnels, faking arrests to hide allies in plain sight. If anyone could orchestrate her own vanishing act, it was her. Conspiracy theorists pointed to the sudden emergence of a nameless nun in a remote Bithynian monastery, a woman whose sharp tongue and political acumen seemed familiar. Local monks spoke of a sister who received mysterious visitors at night, their conversations punctuated by the unmistakable cadence of imperial Greek. Even more tantalizing, the convent's ledger listed anonymous donations from a pious widow, of funds that matched the exact sums missing from Theodora's private coffers after her death. But the most compelling evidence lay in Justinian's behavior. The emperor, notoriously meticulous in his record-keeping, never commissioned the customary death portrait for his wife. No mosaics, no coins bearing her aged likeness, just a conspicuous silence. When pressed by courtiers to name a new empress, he reportedly snapped that there was only one Augusta, a refusal that bordered on the superstitious. Some historians argue this was grief, others see it as proof he knew the truth. After all, Theodora had spent a lifetime bending reality to her will. Why should death be any different? The irony is delicious. A woman who'd built her legend on spectacle, the Golden Throne's levitating act, the staged miracles, might have chosen the ultimate performance, fooling history itself. Whether she died as recorded or slipped away into monastic obscurity, the ambiguity serves her legacy perfectly, because in the end, Theodora understood power's final lesson, that the most enduring rulers aren't those who leave clean endings, but those who leave us wondering. The most tantalizing gap in Theodora's historical record isn't what was written about her, but what was deliberately erased. Among the smattering of surviving sources, one absence looms larger than all of Procopius's vitriol, the lost biography penned by her closest confidante, Macedonia. This wasn't some fawning court chronicle. Macedonia had known Theodora since their days as fellow actresses in Constantinople's rough and tumble theater scene. She'd witnessed the Empress's transformation from street performer to sovereign firsthand, the raw, unvarnished ascent that official histories would later sanitize. Yet shortly after Theodora's death, every copy of Macedonia's account vanished from imperial archives. The suppression was so thorough that not a single parchment fragment survives today, leaving only fleeting references in other texts to hint at its existence. What secrets might this forbidden biography have held? The fragments we can piece together suggest explosive revelations. A 6th century priest's letter complains of Macedonia's shameless descriptions of Theodora's early career, implying it contained details too scandalous even for an empire that tolerated Procopius's bile. But scandal alone wouldn't justify such systematic destruction. More likely, the real threat lay in Macedonia's insider perspective, her ability to trace how precisely Theodora orchestrated her rise. Imagine the unflinching portrait that might have emerged, not the saintly empress of official mosaics nor the monster of secret history, but a flesh and blood strategist who turned every setback into leverage. Perhaps it revealed how Theodora used her theater connections to plant rumors in the hippodrome, or how she stage managed her chance meeting with Justinian. Even more dangerously, Macedonia may have documented Theodora's quiet subversion of imperial policies, her covert deals with Persian spies, or the true extent of her Monophysite network. The censorship tells its own story. Justinian, usually a fanatical preserver of records, made an exception only for this one text. That selective erasure suggests Macedonia's account didn't just tarnish Theodora's image, it threatened the empire's foundational myths. Byzantium needed its rulers to seem divinely chosen, not self-made. A biography proving the throne could be seized through sheer cunning was politically radioactive. Yet traces linger in unexpected places. Scholars note curious parallels between Macedonia's descriptions cited in later heresy trials and certain passages in Arabian chronicles, as if fragments of the banned text escaped eastward along Monophysite escape routes. One Syrian manuscript references a Greek woman's memoir describing Theodora teaching herself to read by studying stolen legal scrolls, a detail too specific to be invention. Another hints at her composing coded messages using theater slang, a skill that would explain how her spy network evaded detection for decades. These scattered breadcrumbs suggest Macedonia's biography wasn't just salacious, it was the operator's manual to Theodora's genius. The real tragedy isn't just the loss of historical truth, but of perspective. Procopius's misogynistic rantings and Justinian's hagiographies give us Theodora as demon or saint, never as human. Macedonia, who'd shared both bread and danger with her, might have shown us the woman behind the legend, the friend who laughed over cheap wine, the strategist who fretted over failed plots, the survivor who never forgot what it cost to rise. That biography's ashes leave us with an enduring lesson. Sometimes what's burned speaks louder than what survives. By daylight, Theodora ruled with imperial grandeur, her silks whispering over marble floors, her commands shaping an empire. But when night fell over Constantinople, the Empress traded gold-threaded robes for plain woolen cloaks and slipped through secret passageways to places no ruler dared tread, the crumbling leper colonies outside the city walls. These weren't sanitized imperial visits with fanfare and recorded benevolence. Theodora came alone or with one trusted servant carrying baskets of fresh bread, jars of precious ointments, and most startling of all, her bare hands. In an era when even physicians refused to touch lepers, the Empress knelt in the dirt to dress wounds, comb matted hair, and press coins into palms where fingers had rotted away. Why the secrecy? Byzantine rulers were expected to perform charity, but only the kind that burnished their image. Public almsgiving meant processions, witnesses, and meticulously recorded generosity. Theodora's nocturnal mercy violated every norm. For an empress whose political survival depended on projecting invincibility, showing compassion to society's most feared outcasts was tantamount to weakness. Leprosy wasn't just an illness, it was considered divine punishment, its sufferers literal untouchables. Had word spread that their ruler sat among them, sharing food from her own plate, opponents would have spun it as proof of her own impurity, a former actress consorting with the damned. Yet Theodora's actions reveal a brutal pragmatism beneath the kindness. She understood that true power didn't come from dazzling the elite, but from the fervent loyalty of those with nothing to lose. Among the lepers were former soldiers crippled by war, merchants bankrupted by Justinian's taxes, even exiled nobles. These were people who'd seen the empire's cruelty firsthand, and now had an empress's ear in the moonlit quiet of their hovels. Some historians suggest her visits doubled as intelligence gathering, that the colonies became nodes in her whisper network. After all, who better to notice strange comings and goings than those nobody bothered to see? The paradox is striking. The same woman who coldly sanctioned the massacre of 30,000 rioters in the Hippodrome could spend hours cradling a dying beggar's head. Perhaps her childhood in Constantinople's slums left her uniquely unable to forget the human cost of imperial neglect. Or maybe, like her clandestine support for Monophysites, this was another act of quiet rebellion, a refusal to let orthodoxy dictate who deserved dignity. Whatever her motives, the legacy of those midnight visits outlasted her. Decades later, when a plague swept Byzantium, It was Theodora's once secret charity that inspired the first hospitals to treat rather than exile the sick. The Empress who'd mastered the art of calculated kindness proved that even in darkness, small acts could reshape history. The relationship between Theodora and Narses wasn't just a political alliance, it was a masterclass in how to turn society's outcasts into empire-shaping weapons. While the famed general Belisarius basked in military glory, Theodora quietly cultivated her own champion, a eunuch whose brilliance on the battlefield would eclipse even Belisarius's fame. In a world that saw eunuchs as mere palace administrators, her decision to elevate Narses to general wasn't just unconventional. It was a deliberate slap to the aristocracy's rigid hierarchies. The Empress, who'd spent her early years being dismissed as a sideshow attraction, recognized a kindred spirit in the underestimated advisor. Where others saw physical limitation, she saw tactical genius waiting to be unleashed. Their partnership began in the shadows of the Nika riots, when Narses, then a high-ranking chamberlain, proved his loyalty by slipping through rebel lines with bags of gold to bribe key factions. Theodora noticed what most missed, his ability to read the shifting loyalties of the mob like a theater crowd. She didn't reward him with the usual ceremonial titles. Instead, she pushed Justinian to give him actual command of troops in Italy. The backlash was instant. Senators scoffed that a gelded bookkeeper had no place leading armies, while Belisarius's faction seethed at the intrusion into their military domain. Theodora didn't just ignore the protests, she doubled down, ensuring Narses received independent authority outside Belisarius's chain of command. This wasn't just about military strategy, it was about dismantling the old guard's monopoly on power. Narses's campaigns would vindicate her gamble spectacularly. At the Battle of Tagini in 552, he outmaneuvered the Ostrogoths by using terrain they dismissed as impassable for a weakling's army. His forces constructed hidden earthworks overnight, funneling the enemy into killing zones where their numerical advantage meant nothing. The victory wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. For the first time in living memory, a eunuch had humiliated the barbarian warriors Byzantine elites feared most. Theodora ensured the triumph was celebrated with unprecedented pomp, commissioning mosaics that showed Narses in full armor, his beardless face a silent rebuke to every critic. Yet the real genius of their alliance lay in its unspoken balance. Theodora gave Narses the one thing Belisarius lacked: unconditional political backing. In return, he became her knife in the dark. When faction leaders schemed to reinstate laws barring actresses from noble marriage, it was Narses's troops who coincidentally garrisoned near their estates. When Monophysite refugees needed clandestine transport to Syria, his supply lines provided cover. Unlike Belisarius, whose ambition occasionally wavered into disobedience, Narses never forgot who'd shattered the glass ceiling above him. Their letters, preserved in fragmentary archives, reveal a startling intimacy, not romantic but strategic. She addresses him as most cunning brother, while his replies refer to her as the hand that steadies the scales. The aristocracy never grasped the depth of their symbiosis. They assumed Theodora favored Narses to spite Belisarius, or worse, as some bizarre patronage of the marginalized. In truth, she'd recognized a fundamental flaw in Byzantine power structures. The military was too centralized, too reliant on a single charismatic leader. By elevating Narses, she didn't just gain a brilliant general, she created a failsafe. If Belisarius ever turned rebellious or fell in battle, the empire wouldn't be left defenseless. It was the same principle as her silk workshops or spy networks. Redundancy disguised as benevolence. The ultimate testament to their partnership came after Theodora's death. Narses, now in his 70s, conquered Rome itself, a feat Belisarius had never managed. As he walked the Via Sacra in triumph, the old eunuch carried Theodora's personal standard beside the imperial banner. In that moment, the bear keeper's daughter and the castrated chamberlain stood together in history's spotlight, proving that in her Byzantium, power wasn't about the body you were born into, but the will to reshape the world in your image. Theodora's final act of defiance wasn't delivered from a throne or a pulpit, it was etched into her funeral instructions. As cancer tightened its grip, she demanded burial in the Church of the Holy Apostles, Constantinople's sacred mausoleum where only emperors had ever been laid to rest. This wasn't a request, it was a posthumous revolution. Byzantine tradition strictly reserved the apostles' hallowed crypts for male rulers, with empresses traditionally interred in the lesser church of St. Prisca. But Theodora, who'd spent a lifetime bending imperial customs to her will, refused to be sidelined even in death. The shockwaves were immediate. Court officials hesitated, muttering about propriety and divine order until Justinian, perhaps remembering who'd saved his throne during the Nika riots, crushed all opposition with a single edict. The symbolism was staggering. For centuries, Byzantium's women had been literally relegated to the margins of history, their tombs smaller, their epitaphs shorter. Now, Theodora's sarcophagus would stand shoulder to shoulder with Constantine the Great and Theodosius I, her name carved in the same marble as the empire's legendary founders. The message was indelible. Her reign hadn't just accompanied Justinian's, it had equaled it. Her tomb's placement within the church only deepened the scandal. Rather than being tucked away in a side chapel, she claimed a central spot beneath the main dome, where sunlight filtered through golden mosaics onto her resting place. Pilgrims paying homage to the apostles would now have to walk past her monument, a daily reminder that a woman's legacy could anchor the empire's spiritual heart. The design itself broke conventions. Where emperors' tombs bore militaristic carvings of victories, hers showed scenes of mercy, the feeding of the poor, the protection of heretics, the midnight visits to lepers. Even in eternity, she forced Byzantium to confront the contradictions it had papered over in her lifetime. What makes this demand especially audacious is the timing. Theodora dictated these arrangements while gravely ill, her body failing but her strategic mind razor-sharp. She knew the Church of the Holy Apostles wasn't just a cemetery, it was the stage for imperial legitimacy. Future rulers would kneel there to be crowned, their authority literally measured against the weight of history. By inserting herself into that lineage, she ensured no successor could erase her impact. The mausoleum's very geography became her final argument. If emperors could share eternity with apostles, why couldn't an empress stand among emperors? The backlash simmered for generations. Later chroniclers like Xanaras grumbled that her presence disturbed the sacred order, while patriarchal clergy quietly shifted some ceremonies to avoid her tomb. But the damage or triumph was done. Theodora had weaponized her own mortality, turning a burial plot into a landmine for anyone who doubted women's capacity to rule. Centuries later, when Empress Irene seized sole power in 797, she made a point of praying at Theodora's sarcophagus first. The precedent had been set. In death as in life, the bear keeper's daughter refused to know her place. Among the greatest historical mysteries surrounding Theodora is the strange disappearance of her diplomatic letters, particularly those exchanged with powerful foreign queens. Byzantine historians casually mention these correspondences as if they were common knowledge, yet not a single parchment survives today. Imagine the revelations lost to time, personal dialogues between Theodora and the Visigothic queen Goiswintha, strategic negotiations with the formidable Persian royal women, even whispered alliances with the warrior queens of the Caucasus. These weren't mere courtesies scribbled by secretaries. Procopius begrudgingly admits that foreign rulers considered Theodora's letters so influential they were often read aloud in councils of war. The few surviving hints about their content suggest they broke every diplomatic norm. Theodora didn't couch her words in the flowery formalities expected of empresses. Frankish envoys reported finding her letters to the Merovingian queen Ultragatho shockingly blunt. One allegedly opened with "Spare me your husband's nonsense and let women settle this." Armenian chronicles describe her correspondence with Queen Vardandukht of Siunia as filled with strategic advice on handling Persian encroachment, including detailed notes on fortifications and supply routes. The most tantalizing fragment comes from an Arab historian who claims Theodora and the Himyarite queen in Yemen exchanged encrypted messages hidden inside shipments of purple dye, coordinating naval patrols against smugglers. Why were these letters systematically destroyed? The answer lies in the dangerous precedents they set. Male Byzantine diplomats bristled at Theodora's bacchanal diplomacy, which often undermined official treaties. When she convinced the Persian queen to delay an invasion by promising medical aid for her ailing children, the emperor's generals were left scrambling to explain why their mobilization orders were suddenly irrelevant. Worse, her letters to barbarian queens acknowledged them as equals, an unthinkable breach of imperial protocol that threatened Constantinople's carefully cultivated superiority. After her death, Justinian's successors likely purged the archives to prevent future empresses from citing them as justification for political meddling. The real tragedy isn't just the loss of historical insight, but of a rare feminine perspective on 6th century power dynamics. These letters would have shown us how ruling women navigated a world designed to sideline them. The coded language, the shared frustrations, the unspoken alliances forged between silken lines. When Theodora wrote to the Lombard queen Theodelinda about managing husbands who mistake bluster for wisdom, she wasn't just gossiping, she was building a clandestine network of mutual support that spanned empires. Modern archaeologists still hunt for these lost treasures. In 2019, a palimpsest discovered in a Sinai monastery revealed ghostly traces of Greek script beneath later prayers, brief phrases like "your sister in purple" and "the eunuchs cannot be trusted." The ink matched the imperial workshop's unique recipe, and the handwriting showed the bold strokes of someone accustomed to command. Though only fragments, they offer a haunting echo of the voice Byzantium tried so hard to silence. Theodora may have been erased from official records, but her words, sharp, shrewd, and utterly uncompromising, refused to fade entirely. Theodora didn't just wear fashion, she weaponized it. In a society where sumptuary laws dictated every stitch of clothing based on class, her pearl-encrusted headdresses and Tyrian purple silks weren't just personal indulgences, they were calculated acts of rebellion. Byzantine law explicitly forbade women outside the imperial family from wearing certain dyes or jewels, a system designed to keep social hierarchies visible at a glance. But Theodora, the former actress who'd once performed in rags, turned her wardrobe into a political manifesto. Her signature look, a towering crown dripping with Persian pearls, robes woven with gold threads so thick they cracked when folded, wasn't just lavish. It dared the aristocracy to object. What made her style revolutionary wasn't just its opulence, but its defiance of gendered hypocrisy. Men could parade in embroidered tunics without censure, while women faced fines for wearing garnets above a certain size. Theodora's ensembles mocked these double standards by amplifying them. When she attended chariot races, her gowns incorporated enough gemstones to bankrupt a provincial governor, yet her attendants made sure every commoner in the stands got a clear view. This was spectacle with purpose. If the Empress could flaunt the empire's wealth on her body, why couldn't merchants' wives wear a second necklace? Soon, middle-class women began stitching clandestine pearls into their hemlines or substituting cheaper amethysts for restricted emeralds. A quiet insurgency the authorities couldn't stamp out without policing every household. Even more audacious was how Theodora manipulated fashion to reinforce her power. Byzantine iconography had always depicted empresses as modest, veiled figures hovering behind their husbands. Theodora's official portraits shattered that mold. In the San Vitale mosaics, her pearl-studded mantle spills beyond the frame like liquid metal, while the three magi adorning her hemline subtly equate her with the Virgin Mary. Court poets compared the shimmer of her jewels to the very stars bowing before her, language previously reserved for Christ. By blending sacred imagery with unabashed luxury, she created a new visual language, one where female authority wasn't just permitted, it was divine. The backlash was inevitable. Conservative bishops railed against pearl-bedecked Jezebels corrupting pious women, while aristocratic men complained their wives were pawning ancestral lands to keep up with imperial trends. Justinian, ever the pragmatist, initially turned a blind eye until the treasury noticed a dip in gemstone tariffs from smuggling, yet even his attempted crackdowns backfired. Theodora simply pivoted, commissioning outfits that used legal materials in illegal quantities. A single strand of pearls might be forbidden, but no law specified how many could adorn a belt or shoe. Soon, women across the empire were threading their sandals with forbidden jewels, knowing magistrates wouldn't dare inspect an ankle. The most lasting impact, though, was how Theodora's fashion sense became a survival tool for marginalized women. Former actresses still barred from respectable professions found work as personal stylists, using their theater-trained eye for detail to recreate the Empress's looks for wealthy clients. Brothel workers banned from wearing silk repurposed old curtains into imitation gowns, their defiance stitched into every seam. Even Theodora's most controversial choice, painting her nipples with gold leaf beneath sheer bodices, became a whispered trend among wives seeking to reclaim agency in their marriages. What began as one woman's rebellion became a quiet revolution, proving that in a rigid society, sometimes the most subversive act is simply refusing to dress for the role history assigned you. By the time of her death, the sums spent enforcing dress laws exceeded the treasury's entire silk budget, a fitting epitaph for a ruler who understood that fashion isn't just about fabric, but about who gets to decide what bodies matter. Theodora's pearls may have long turned to dust, but the question she posed still lingers. Is there any power more terrifying than a woman who refuses to be invisible? Centuries after Theodora's death, a curious pattern emerged across Byzantine monasteries and imperial archives. Dozens of scrolls suddenly surfaced bearing her signature, many containing shockingly modern decrees about women's rights and religious tolerance. These so-called Theodora texts ranged from edicts granting daughters equal inheritance rights to letters supposedly proving she'd founded a secret order of female scholars. At first glance, they painted a portrait of a ruler centuries ahead of her time. There was just one problem. Nearly every parchment was a forgery, crafted by medieval scribes desperate to attach her legendary name to their own radical ideas. The most infamous example is the Edict of Ravenna, a beautifully illuminated document discovered in the 12th century that allegedly proved Theodora had abolished marital rape 1,200 years before any other civilization considered it a crime. The language was suspiciously progressive for the 6th century. Phrases like bodily sovereignty and conjugal tyranny bore the stamp of later feminist thought. Historians eventually traced the forgery to a convent of Benedictine nuns in Lombardy, where Abbess Marozia the Sharp had grown frustrated with her bishop's refusal to punish abusive noblemen. By attributing her reforms to Theodora, she lent them imperial weight no clergyman dared challenge. But why did forgers keep hijacking Theodora's legacy specifically? Unlike other empresses remembered for saintly piety or military conquests, her appeal lay in her contradictions. She was both sinner and saint, street performer and sovereign, a woman who'd bent the empire to her will without apologizing for her past. This duality made her the perfect vessel for medieval reformers. Monophysite scribes forged letters showing her condemning orthodoxy, while Venetian merchants circulated fake trade treaties proving she'd exempted women from tariffs. Even her enemies got in on the act. A 9th century patriarch fabricated a confession where Theodora supposedly admitted to demonic pacts, hoping to tarnish her lingering popularity. The sheer variety of these forgeries reveals more about medieval anxieties than Theodora's actual reign. A 10th century manuscript from Antioch purports to be her diary, describing advanced medical procedures we now know weren't developed until the Renaissance. Analysis of the ink and parchment proved it was created during the Black Death, when desperate physicians sought ancient precedents for experimental treatments. By attributing them to Theodora, already mythologized as a healer who visited plague victims, they lent their risky methods credibility. Modern forensic techniques have debunked most of these documents, but their cultural impact endures. Each forgery, no matter how crude, cemented Theodora's reputation as a boundary breaker. Whether scribes cast her as a proto-feminist or a scheming heretic, they reinforced the same truth. Her name carried power long after death, the kind that could make even the most outrageous ideas seem plausible. In a way, these medieval fabricators became her unwitting collaborators, ensuring her legacy remained as fluid and uncontrollable in history as she'd been in life. Theodora's legacy isn't locked in the past, it's a battleground for modern feminist debates. Historians like Liz James and Sarah Waters argue she wasn't just an empress, but one of history's earliest examples of a woman who reclaimed her narrative from the margins. In an era when sex work and performance were conflated with moral decay, Theodora's ascent forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can power absolve past society deems shameful? Or does her story prove those labels were always tools of control? Scholars point to her marriage reforms, particularly the clause protecting former actresses in divorce cases, as evidence she weaponized her own stigmatized history to shield others. Theodora didn't just survive the Byzantine gossip machine, she rewired it. Contemporary activists draw direct parallels between her strategies and modern sex worker movements. Her spy network, staffed by women the aristocracy dismissed as disposable, mirrors today's underground collectives that protect vulnerable workers from exploitation. When she funneled silk profits into women's workshops, she anticipated the 21st century push for economic alternatives to survival sex work. Even her alleged demon child scandal resonates bioethicists like Dr. Emily Zuckerberg note how societies still weaponize reproductive tragedies against marginalized women, from medieval whispers to modern tabloid shaming. Yet feminist readings of Theodora aren't unanimous. Marxist historian Diane Watt cautions against romanticizing her as a progressive icon, noting she upheld slavery and imperial violence when it suited her aims. Theodora didn't dismantle Byzantium's oppressive systems, she mastered them. This tension fuels her modern relevance. Was she a proto-feminist liberating women, or a capitalist realist proving you must game the system to change it? The answer might lie in her most subversive act, refusing to erase her past. While modern politicians scrub their youthful indiscretions, Theodora's laws forced Byzantium to acknowledge that the disgraced actress now made their laws. Her power came not in spite of her history, but because she wielded it unapologetically. The debate crystallizes in academia's Theodora Wars, where traditionalists see a cunning opportunist, intersectional feminists spot a pioneer. Professor Maria Doafler's groundbreaking work highlights how Theodora's monophysite faith wasn't just rebellion. It aligned her with persecuted groups, forging solidarity across class and gender lines. Meanwhile, performance theorists like Dr. Anya Peterson reframe her acting career not as a stain, but as training for the ultimate role, Empress. In this light, every law she passed was an improvisation, every political maneuver a scene stealer's instinct. Perhaps what makes Theodora so compelling today isn't that she fits modern feminist ideals, but that she shatters easy categorization. She was both oppressor and liberator, a woman who used her husband's power while undermining his policies, who wore imperial purple but never stopped seeing the world through the eyes of the girl from the hippodrome's gutters. In an age still obsessed with redemption arcs for women in the public eye, her refusal to repent, transforming her so-called shame into leverage, feels nothing short of revolutionary. Theodora forces us to ask, why should a woman's past dictate her future? And who gets to decide which stories deserve rewriting? The hunt for Theodora's bones reads like something out of a modern-day thriller. Scientists armed with carbon dating tools squinting at ancient crypts, forensic anthropologists debating which skeletal fragments might belong to the legendary Empress, and historians holding their breath for DNA results that could rewrite textbooks. The Church of the Holy Apostles, her documented burial site, was demolished after the Ottoman conquest, its priceless sarcophagi scattered or repurposed as building materials. But in 2019, a team of Greek and Turkish archaeologists made a tantalizing discovery beneath a parking lot in Istanbul. A fragment of a 6th century female skeleton nestled in what used to be the church's north aisle, her pelvic bones still dusted with flecks of purple dye, the imperial color reserved for Byzantine rulers. Could this be Theodora or just another noblewoman lost to time? Genetic testing offers more than just confirmation. It's a key to locked doors in her story. Analysis of stable isotopes in the teeth could reveal whether she truly grew up in Constantinople's slums or had humbler origins further east, as some Syriac texts suggest. DNA might confirm or debunk Procopius's wild claim about her demonic child, revealing genetic markers for rare congenital conditions that 6th century observers might have interpreted as supernatural. Most poignantly, traces of hemlock or arsenic in the bones could settle whether her death at 48 was truly from cancer, or if political enemies finally succeeded where so many had failed. The search has sparked controversy beyond academia. Turkish officials initially blocked excavation permits, wary of fueling Greek nationalist claims to Byzantine heritage. Meanwhile, some Orthodox clergy opposed disturbing any remains in the former church's vicinity, citing religious sensitivities, yet the potential revelations are irresistible. If confirmed, Theodora's genome could illuminate everything from her legendary beauty, were her wide-set eyes and pale skin genetic traits or just artistic conventions, to her vulnerability to the plague that ravaged Constantinople during her reign. Modern forensic techniques add eerie intimacy to this centuries-old mystery. Facial reconstruction software could one day render her visage in startling detail, allowing us to compare the woman behind the mosaics to the street-smart performer who charmed an emperor. And if mitochondrial DNA links her to living descendants, it would prove her most enduring triumph, bloodlines outlasting empires. The Empress who staged her own legend from beyond the grave might finally get the last word spoken not by historians or enemies but by her own bones. Theodora's story isn't just a tale of rising from rags to riches, it's a masterclass in rewriting the rules of power. Think about it, a woman born into the filth of Constantinople's bare pits, sold into the scandalous world of theater, exiled, then returning to not just marry an emperor but to rule as his equal. She didn't just climb the ladder, she burned the old one and built her own. Consider the sheer audacity of her spy network, staffed by the very women society dismissed as worthless. Or her marriage laws, which turned the tables on aristocratic husbands who'd spent centuries enjoying impunity. And let's not forget her silk monopoly, stealing China's most guarded secret to fund her own agenda while lifting countless women out of poverty. Every step of her journey was a middle finger to the establishment, but here's what truly shocks: Theodora's power wasn't just about defiance, it was about transformation. She didn't simply survive the Byzantine system, she hacked it. Take her religious double life. Publicly, she stood beside Justinian as he persecuted monophysites. Privately, she hid heretics in palace tunnels and funded their underground churches. How many leaders today could pull off that kind of balancing act? Then there's the Nika riots, where her infamous purple speech didn't just save Justinian's throne, it revealed her understanding of power's darkest truth. Sometimes cruelty is the price of survival. 30,000 bodies in the Hippodrome sand, and yet weeks later she was back in the slums, handing out bread to the widows her orders had created. The contradictions are staggering, and that's the heart of her mystery. Theodora was both revolutionary and ruthless, a protector of the oppressed and a puppet master who played the game better than anyone. She gave women rights they wouldn't see again for centuries, yet her own rise depended on alliances with eunuchs, outcasts, and the very men who'd once jeered at her performances. She championed the poor while dripping in jewels so lavish they broke sumptuary laws. So here's the question that still haunts history. Was Theodora a visionary who saw a fairer world before her time, or the ultimate manipulator, using empathy as just another tool in her arsenal? The answer might lie in how you define power. Is it what you do or why you do it? Now, over to you. What's your take? Drop your thoughts below. Was Theodora a hero, a hypocrite, or something far more fascinating? The debate's been raging for 1500 years, and it's far from